The episode of today is going to be specifically about all the different terminology that you have in real estate and why you should know this basically. Now, whenever you get into the real estate and whenever you, let me just get the chart straight. Whenever you get into real estate and you want to start investing into it, most likely banks, investors, or people you want to gather money from, or even if you have to talk to brokers, for example, or even just people that try to sell you the apartments. Most of the times they want to know if you are a qualified investor, if you know what you're doing, and most of the time they're just going to try to hit you with some terms that you might or you might not understand, depending if they explain it to you, if you read it somewhere. And it's very hard for you sometimes to get a deal done or to, for example, get a loan from the bank also. That's a requirement that you have in most of the deals. And it's going to be very hard, very difficult if you really don't know anything about real estate, or for example, if you don't really know a lot of the terminology. So that's why I wanted to explain it to you in this video. I actually will take some of the terms from a book about real estate that I read recently, about a few months ago, and I will just take term per term, one by one, and I'm just gonna explain to you what the meaning is and how can you calculate it, how can you make sense of it, because most likely they will become useful whenever you have to start investing, or whenever somebody will have to speak with you, or in most of the cases you have to know this stuff, especially if you speak with a bank. Now, first thing first, what is the purchase price? Not yellow, thanks. What is the purchase price? Well, the name might just suggest it, right? The purchase price. Purchase price is basically the total amount of money that is required to pay the property, to basically buy the property for someone else. Now, the price of the property includes also the closing costs. So it's not only price of the property, but it includes also the closing costs, the legal fees. So it's gonna be plus closing, plus fees. Sorry for my writing, I'm on the computer. So plus the fees, the document fees, for example, if you have some lawyers or if you have a broker, they might just ask you for fees as well. Just make sure that you take these ones into considerations, because most of the time what ends up happening, you make a purchase of a property just based on the down payment that you need. So for example, if you have you want to pay for a property that is $10,000, but you have only $20,000, and you say, oh, perfect, 20,000 is exactly the amount that I need for the down payment. Well, take into the consideration that even though you have the 20,000, you will not be able to finish the transactions, just because closing costs might be 2 to 3%. There might be like another 1,000, 2,000 euros, plus additional fees for closing costs, document fees, broker fees, and so you will most likely need about 23 to 25,000 dollars just to make sure that you can close all the purchase costs and to make the transaction go through, basically. So always keep that in mind. Next, we have the down payment, the DP, the down payment. Now, the down payment, what is it? Basically, when you want to purchase a property, you have to put some money down unless you want to purchase the property full cash. And it is very, very, very not recommended that you pay the property in cash, because whenever you pay a property full cash, is going to give you a return that is going to be lower, about 5%. While at the same time, if you take a debt from the bank, you're going to end up having 7% to even higher for small properties, even 10% return on the total money you invested. And the debt is going to be paid down by the people renting the property. So it's always recommended that you take a loan from the bank, you take a mortgage in order to be able to pay for the property. So if a property price is 100,000 and you want to purchase it, but you don't have all the 100,000, you have like 30,000. The down payment, in this case, you go to a bank and the bank is going to say, well, we want to insure this payment, but you need to give us some insurance. So what are they going to ask you for security insurance? They're going to ask you for a certain amount of money that you're going to pay immediately to secure some of the payments in advance. So usually the average payment is 20% down payment. This is the very average that you can find in all countries. Usually the down payment can go down depending on the type of loan that you get, but usually with banks is 20%. Some banks may even go lower to 10%, and if you take an FHA loan, meaning backed by federal institutions, can go up to 3 to 5%. And the fact is, if you go for this one, yes, you put down a very, very little amount of money, but they're going to be asking you every month for some additional fees, because you are putting down a very, very low amount, so they're going to be hitting you very hard with another fee that I don't really remember the name right now. Also, if you put down lower than 20%, a bank is always going to have to ask you for higher interest rates, meaning a percentage on a yearly basis is going to be higher. For example, leverage is 5%, maybe they're going to be asking you for 6-7%. And so you need to be careful, because you want to calculate different scenarios for the down payment, especially for properties not making enough cash flow. You can put more money down, and you can simply, instead of putting 20%, you can put 30% down, and that will guarantee that the remaining amount of money that you have is going to be 70,000 that you took the loan from, and you have to pay 70,000 over 30 years. And so the payments are going to be every month. It doesn't matter, it doesn't change. So if you pay 80 or if you pay 70, it doesn't really change the amount of time, but it's going to change the amount of money that you have to pay on a monthly basis. So you can increase your down payment to lower your monthly payments on the mortgage. Another thing you can do, but this is only when you go higher than 16 units, 32 units, is whenever you want, but even higher than this, I think. Whenever you want to do an interest-only mortgage, an interest-only loan, you can simply put down a higher down payment, and basically the bank is going to not ask you to pay the principal for a certain amount of time. Now, I don't want to confuse you, but it's just, I'm going to explain this further on later. But for example, if you pay a property 100 million, and you put down, of course not for the 32 units, you would have to be around 100 units to pay that much. In this case, you can simply tell the bank, hey, I want to have a higher cash flow at the beginning, so a higher amount of money on a monthly basis. And they're gonna say, okay, but you have to put more money down. So you will put 35 million down. It can come up even to 40 million. And simply what ends up happening, you have an interest only, meaning that instead of paying every month back to the bank the principal, meaning the remaining $65 million, and the percentage, the 4-5% of interests, you're only paying 5% interest on a yearly basis for the next 5-10 years. That is negotiable with the bank. So you can actually increase your down payment to make sure that for a certain period of time you don't pay the principal down, you pay only interest, and this increases your cash flow, because the amount of money the property make is always the same. But if I don't have to pay the mortgage down and then pay only the interest, it means I have a lower expenses to pay on a monthly basis, and that will increase my cash flow. That is very helpful when you have a new property and it's not rented fully. So in order to protect yourself, because maybe it's not making enough money yet to cover for the mortgage, you can simply put down more money at the beginning and you will have a lower payment on a monthly basis, and you can make sure that you can cover them on a long-term basis. Let's go to the next one, which is the DCR, which is debt coverage ratio. Debt coverage ratio. Now, the debt coverage ratio is basically a ratio which is basically how can I call it? Let's say a number, a percentage that the bank is going to ask you in order to protect your property. Meaning the bank is going to say, well, your property is making $100,000 per month, and your payments do not have to surpass, actually it's the opposite, meaning that if this one is the amount of money that you have to pay on a monthly basis to the bank, this is my mortgage, 100,000 euros per month, the bank is going to ask you that you make at least 1.25 higher, meaning 125% higher. In this case, if the debt is $100,000, you have to make $125,000 on a monthly basis to cover your debt. Meaning the bank is they will require the property to be very, very safe, to make a lot of money, to make enough cash flow, to cover the payments, even if the property goes negative. Meaning even if some people move out, you still have enough percentage here, you still have enough money left over for you to sustain any loss of the property. And so the bank is going to be more comfortable, and they're certainly going to ask you about the debt coverage ratio after a certain amount of units. And you really want to know this. Usually the good number for the bank is 1.25. And this is usually what they will be requiring, what they will ask of you. And so just make sure that you can run the number properly on a real estate deal. On the other episode, if you remember, I explained to you how you can calculate your mortgage, so you're certain that you can calculate your debt coverage ratio. What you can do is simply, on the other episode, I explained you how to calculate the mortgage. You take the mortgage on a monthly basis, what's the payment, and you multiply that per 1.25, and you're going to find out what your total amount of money is according to this debt coverage ratio. Meaning if my debt is 100, I multiply per 1.25, my total debt coverage ratio necessary, my coverage necessary on a monthly basis is 125. Then you take the amount of money the property makes, and you say, well, the bank wants me to make at least 125. How much does the property make? Well, it does, you multiply the rents, you find out, and if it makes more than 125, then you're all good. That coverage ratio is okay, it's all good. You can be approved for a loan. Then we go into the loan term. We're speaking about mortgages and loans. So the loan term is basically how the loan is going to be broken down. And you have a loan from the bank. They're going to be asking you to decide how you want the term of the loan to be. First of all, the loan can be, you can decide how long it's going to be. It can be 5 years, it can be 10 years. Usually it's not 5 if you're buying a property, because you will never be able to make enough cash flow to pay off in 5 years. But usually it can be 15, 20 or 30. Usually you go in between 15 or 30. Usually these are your top choices, 15 or 30 for properties. Now, you always want to pick the longest term possible, and this is because if you pick 15, it means that on a monthly basis your amount is going to be much higher, and so you're not going to make as much cash flow. You're going to pay down the debt much quicker, but you're not making enough cash flow. You're reducing it to the very minimum, and that can be a problem in case you have higher occupancy, people move out of the property, or there is a downturn in the market, or some very bad things happen in the property. Your loan payment is going to be high, but at the same time, the property is going to start making less and less and less, and it's very risky that you have a 15-year loan because the payments are going to be very high. So it's very likely that if you take a 15, you have to be very careful because the property may go back to the bank. While on the other side, if you have a 30 years, it's much better because the payments are going to be all the same for the next 30 years. And it doesn't matter, they don't adjust to inflation, it's going to be the same for the next 30 years. So this is going to be the longest term possible, they don't usually go higher than that. And that means that your monthly payments are going to be very minimal, the lowest as possible. Another thing the bank will ask you to choose in between is a percentage. It's an interest that is another thing the bank is going to ask you is if you want a percentage of interest that is going to be a fixed amount, meaning a fixed percentage, or that is going to be variable. Now you always want to choose a fixed one, and I explain you why. When you have a variable, it might depend on many things. Nobody really knows. The bank really decides what the percentage is going to be, but they're going to tell you, well, at the beginning, in order to try to convince you to take the variable terms, the variable interests, they're going to offer you a very, very, very little percentage for the first years. So you will have like 1.5%, and you're going to be like, wow, they're asking me 1.5% here, and they're asking me for 4% here. Like, obviously, I'm gonna take the variable. No, don't do that. The problem with the variable is that eventually they say it can go up and it can go down. Trust me, it never goes down. They adjust to inflation, they just keep going higher and higher. And because it's variable, it can go up even to 6-7%. And if you're not careful about the variable terms, which you cannot absolutely control, and that's something I really hate on a property, having variables that I do not control, and you don't really want that. Because if my payments are high enough for me to make €100, $100 a month, and then this happens when I have a 3% interest rate. At the beginning I'm making 125 because my interest rate is like, 1.5. And then it starts going higher, it starts going higher, it starts going higher. I find myself suddenly with $50 a month I'm making. And that's not really something that you want, because maybe the next month you're not making any money. The guy moves out, you don't have enough money to cover for the payments. So you do not really want variables in your real estate deals. You do not want something keep going up and down. You don't want to gamble. You want to know a fixed percentage. That means that for the rest of the next 30 years, I know exactly how much my payment is going to be every month for the next 30 years, and it's never going to change. So if I have a fixed rate, my payment will always be the same. No matter what, for the next 30 years, the percentage does not change. While on this side, it can go up, it can go down, and we're gambling, okay? And we do not want to gamble in real estate. Now, the next term is interest rates. I almost explained to you what it is, but I want to go more in specific. The interest rates is basically whenever you get a loan, the bank is going to ask you to pay the amount of the loan, which is the principal down on a monthly basis, and plus, on top of that, they're going to be asking you for an interest, a percentage on a year basis that they're going to be asking you to pay every month. Usually interest rates are as low as 4 to 6%. Depending on the country, in Czech Republic they go even low to 3%. For more risky properties, because if you put less money down, the bank doesn't trust you, or they give you very the more risky it is, the higher the interest rate usually is going to be, the more the risk you have in the property, because they want to ensure that you make higher payments on a monthly basis to get their money back. So they just want to be more insured. Well, on the other side, they can be very low when you put a lot of money down. So if you put 35% of the total amount down, they're going to be asking you for a lower interest rate. They're going to be asking you, I don't know, for 3.5%, right? So there is also a way that you can speak with the bank in order to make sure that you can manage how much the percentage is, and you can negotiate the percentage. Then you have P and I, principal and interest. Now this is basically what I just explained you. Whenever you get a mortgage for a certain amount every month, you have to pay two things. You have to pay the principal, which if I take 100,000 as a loan, actually my house is 100,000, and I take a loan from the bank for 80,000, then my principal is the 80,000, right? Every month the bank wants me to pay back a percentage of this 80,000, a small piece every month of the 80,000 back. So month by month by month, I will pay back the 80,000. Honestly, you are not paying back this 80,000 if you're renting out the property. The people that are renting the property are actually paying for the principal. So that's what's amazing about real estate. So it's the principal, which is the principal payment, of course. That's where the word comes from. And then you have the interest. And I already explained to you what the interest is. So P and I means that your loan is a normal loan, basically. On the normal loans, you have the principal and you have the interest. If you only have the interest, it's an interest-only deal, and I explained to you earlier what this means. You cannot just have interest on, you cannot just have principal pay down. They always ask for some interests. Then we have the closing costs, but this basically already explained to you what it is. Whenever you're closing a real estate transaction, whenever you're purchasing a property, there is going to be a very small percentage of money that they're going to be asking you for closing a transaction, and that is the closing fees. And you always have to take that into consideration, because for bigger properties, they start going higher because it's a percentage. Then we go into the vacancy rate. Vacancy is very important for you to understand. So vacancy basically means that if I have a property, whenever I rent it out, I have, for example, 10 units, and I'm renting out the 10 units, but only 9 are occupied, meaning one is not occupied. It says this one unit is vacant. So my vacancy rate in this case is 10%, because one unit is not occupied, and my occupancy rate is 90%. Very clear, very painless. Then we have the occupancy rate, but I just explained that to you. Economic occupancy. Now this is very similar. Economic occupancy. Now whenever you rent out a property, in some cases you are not going to be able to collect the rents. For example, let's suppose you bought the property 4 months ago and you had 10 units, and you rent out just 8 units, but out of these 8 units, one guy is not paying. One guy this month cannot make the payment. Why? Because he lost his job, because something bad happened, and there is a coronavirus, and he cannot go back to work anymore. He cannot make the payment. He has to find a job. He's not paying this month. Now, the economic occupancy is the number on a percentage, is the number of the units of the property that you're actually collecting the rent on. So it's basically the occupancy collected. So it's not how much in percentage, how many properties are rented, but how much is collected. How many of these units am I taking the rents from? How many am I collecting the rents from? And this is obviously more important than the occupancy rate, because whenever you want to buy a property, even if it's 90% occupied or 100% occupied, but you're collecting the rents from just half, you have to take into consideration just half of the units, because the other half is not paying you any money. So you have to be very careful about that. Then there is, of course, something they call other income. Now, what do they mean by other income? Other income is a term that refers to all the additional income that comes from owning a piece of real estate that doesn't include the rents. So what can it be? It can be, for example, the parking lots. So I put the parking out and it's not really rent, right? You get the parking for the people and they have to pay you $100 extra a month for the parking. That's other income. Another thing could be the laundry. It could be laundry. Well, whatever. I write very badly. The laundry. It could be the late payments. Whenever somebody doesn't pay this month, he pays 3, 4, 5 days later. I can ask for some fees. I can ask for late payment fees, right? And that is considered to be other income. Or a storage unit. I have a storage unit and I ask you a certain amount of money to use it. Or some sort of cleaning for the building. So whenever you have the trash, I come and pick up the trash at your house. I don't want you dragging all the trash around the property. It's going to make oil stains everywhere. I come directly and pick up at your property all the things you throw away. But I'm going to be asking you for $20 every month to do that, or for example, right? And these are all considered to be other income. So they come from the property directly, but they're not renting. They're not the rents. What do we have here then? We have the property management expenses, but you can simply call them expenses. Usually they don't say property managing, blah, blah, blah. They just call them expenses. Now, I have the summons. Okay, property expenses. What are the expenses? Well, the expenses are basically the amount of money that you have to pay to be able to sustain the property and to run the property. Now, whenever you are below 4 units, this is below or equal for 5 units, let's say, because after 4 units it becomes commercial, and usually commercials are required for somebody to manage the property. So if it's 4 units, you can manage it yourself, let's say, because it's small, you don't have to have too much time to invest into the property, and you do not really have property expenses at this point, because maybe you make the light and the water, the gas, all these things you can make them pay to the people that is renting out your unit. So you can simply pay, hey, you will pay for the amount of money you spend on the light, on the water, on the gas. You will make your own contract for the internet, and I will manage the property myself. So in case there is troubles, in case there is anything going wrong at the property, you call me, and in that case you will spend €0 for expenses. However, that is not the case when you are 5 units or higher. Usually when you are going to be in between 5 units to 15, 16 units, let's say from 5 to 12 units, because whenever it goes higher than 12, so it's higher than 12, what happens is here I can take a management company, and usually they will ask for me about 10% to run expenses and to manage the property for myself. It's going to be suboptimal because they're obviously not getting paid too much, and so the service is not going to be the best. You're not paying them a lot, so maybe they're not going to include all the services about how to manage your property. But whenever you go higher than 12, the property is making enough NOI, meaning is making enough money on a monthly basis for you to be able to pay off the expenses. Because whenever you are higher than 12 units, the expenses can go in between 33 to 45%. And that's high numbers. That's high numbers. So here you cannot afford to pay 33 to 45%, or you're gonna be broke, you don't make any money, right? And plus, it's not enough, because you cannot have somebody managing the property for you. The property does not make enough money for you to pay someone to manage them. For 5 units is almost the same thing, but you can pay a company to manage it, and usually they can be asking you about 10% of the total amount of money the property makes. On a property that is instead higher than 12 units, well, in that case, you're going to pay in between 33 to 45%, and they can manage everything for you. So the higher the property is, the more cash flow you have to pay for the expenses, and the less you have to worry about the property. So that's better when you have bigger properties. Then we have the cap rate. The cap rate is the capitalization rate. And this basically means how much the return of my money is on a year basis, considering that I paid cash. Even if I take a loan, even if I take a mortgage, this is considering how much money the property makes. So you take your NOI is how much money the property makes after the expenses, and you divide this by the total price of the property. So the property price, PP, right? NOI divided by the property price will give you 0.00 and something, 5, let's say, usually. And your cap rate means it's 5% in this case, right? What does this mean? It means that on a year basis, every year, I'm making 5% back on the total amount of the property, on the total purchase price. On the total value of the property, I'm making 5% every year. Now, what's a good cap rate? It depends. Once again, you have to divide between small units, so when you are below 10 units, and when you're higher than 10 units. If you're below 10 units, especially if you're 1, 2, 3, 4 units, a good cap rate is going to be in between 6 to even 12%. It can go even higher than that. Usually 12% is when you do reconstructions, for example. It can even go higher, depending on how you manage it. Meaning if you lower your expenses, then there is going to be less money paid in expenses. Your NOI is going to be higher, which means that at the end of the day, you're going to be having a higher cap rate, right? So the lower your expenses, the higher the cap rate. But on the other side, when you go to big properties, your cap rate is going to be lower because the units are bigger and because the property has to be better. So in bigger properties, usually it can be 3.5 for very, very, very nice A properties, and it can go up to 6%. Now 6% is very, very difficult, and whenever you're higher than 16 units, you have to be careful. You say 6%, there is some red flags going on. Why do I say that? Because whenever the property is big, you're higher than 16 units, a 5% cap is good. 6% cap, the higher the cap rate, the riskier the property. Meaning the higher my cap rate, my return is, it may mean that my cash flow is higher, but that can be because the property is much older. The property is in a bad location. The property is in a bad neighborhood. There is a higher chance of people moving out of that place. There is a higher chance of people stealing the car around the area. There is a lot of thievery. There is a lot of theft. There is a lot of bad things at the property. It can be signaling that there is some problems with the water damage. It can be signaling that there is some damages with plumbing or other things, right? So if the cap rate is too high, above 16 units, you have a red flag signaling you something is wrong. If you're higher than 8%, back off. The property has something wrong 100%. Ask them what's wrong with the property. When you're below 10 units, especially if you're little units, the cap rate can go as high as possible, because in this case you don't really have expenses, so your percentage is so high. But above 16 units, be careful, okay? Just be careful. Then we have the cash on cash. Cash on cash is similar, but it's different. And the cash on cash is also a percentage, is also on a yearly basis, but this is calculated on the money I invest. If earlier we were taking the NOI and we were dividing it by the amount of money that the property was costing, the property price, here with the cash on cash, we are taking the NOI and we are dividing it by its cash on cash, which means the cash it's returning from the cash I invested. So it's NOI divided by the price I put down. So usually it's the down payment. Usually it's the down payment plus the closing costs. Okay? So if you take the NOI, this is also good when, for example, you take the debt. You have to calculate this one as well, because on this side you have the cap rate. The cap rate calculates in case you paid full cash, so they don't take into consideration the debt. But here they do, meaning they want to see how much money the property makes on a monthly basis. You already take away all the other expenses, you take that price, you add the closing costs, how much money is coming in my pocket on every month. So I take my NOI and I divide it by this number. I divided by the amount of money I make, and I find the cash on cash. So more simply, it's the return of investment of the money I invested. It's very simple actually. This one, they will probably ask you that. It's good to know. It's more good to know the cap rate actually, because with the banks they may be asking you this if you want to qualify for loans. They're going to be asking you about the vacancy rate. They're going to be asking you about writing down the deal, underwriting, and be sure that you can understand how the deal works. Because if the property is big enough, the bank is your partner. So they want you to really understand what you're doing, and especially if the property is big, there is higher chances, there is higher risk that you lose the property if you don't know what you're doing. So the bank wants you to really know your stuff, and they probably are going to be asking you about these things. We then have the NOI. I really didn't explain to you yet, I mentioned it different times. The NOI is the amount of money the property makes less the expenses. So it's the GOI, which is gross income, basically. Okay, gross income. Gross operating income is actually the terminology. NOI means net operating income. And very simply, the gross operating income, how do you calculate? Well, my property makes $1,000 a month for every unit. I have 12 units. Good, it's making $12,000 a month. This is my gross operating income. How do I calculate the NOI? I take the 12,000 and I take away the expenses. 35% goes away. So I'm basically left with 8,000 and something, right? 8,700. This is my NOI. So I take my gross operating income, I take away my expenses, and I have my NOI. The NOI is very, very, very important. They're certainly going to be asking you about that, and it's very good that you know what the NOI is. If you heard about it, it's without counting the debt. If you remember, it's the gross income, my income, how much money the property makes, less the expenses. And there is no debt. This is before the debt. Okay, so my mortgage payment is not considered here. Everything clear? Now, other things I wanted to mention, maybe regarding the expenses, is other things that you want to count in the expenses is things like the capex. People will want to see the capex when you calculate a property. What is it? Is capital, X is expenditures, capital expenditures. The capex means things that you have to repair, not on a current basis. Meaning I do not have to make a recurrent payment for these things. What can it be? It can be the roof, right? It can be the plumbing. It can be other things like appliances. It can be making the floors again, right? It can be the windows. Now, this is those expenses that are not recurrent. You do not have to make them every month. And they are expenses usually that cost a lot, meaning they come every 20 to 30 years. And you have to take into consideration the capex into the expenses. How can you do that? Because if you're not paying that every month, how can you take it into consideration? Well, you save a small percentage of money or a small sum of money every month from the total amount as an expense. You simply take it and you put it into an account and you save it. And you keep increasing, and you don't touch it. Every month you just leave it there, you put it aside, you don't look at it, and it keeps increasing and you do not touch it. Because later on, when something is going to happen, and trust me, something is going to happen, because you cannot keep a roof for 100 years, eventually you have to change the roof, eventually something breaks, eventually windows break, eventually they have to be replaced, eventually wood gets old, eventually gets cranky, you have to fix stuff eventually. And so it's not about whether it happens or not, it's about when it is going to happen. So if you save $50 a month in an account that you don't touch, and you save it for a year, well, then you have 6,000. You have 600 euros at the end of the year there, and every year you keep increasing 600, 600, 600. So eventually, when the roof has to be changed, you have it there, and you don't have to spend out of your own pocket, and you don't have to take money from the property, and you don't have to ask a loan to a bank. You don't have to ask money from a friend. The property already takes care of itself. Other things expenses have to cover, you always have to take into consideration that expenses are also recurrent expenses. On a monthly basis you have to take care of the property, so make sure that you take everything into consideration in case you're managing the property yourself, because it might not be easy, okay? It's very hard to be a tenant and it's very hard to manage properties. So be sure you take everything into consideration for the expenses. Now, for today, it's everything. I give you a very extensive terminology explanation. However, I did not really go into the very detail of how to calculate and everything, because I was just thinking it would have been too much. I would gonna have longer than 1 hour, and I didn't really want to overwhelm you guys with these things. But these things are very important for you to understand, because whenever you go to a bank and you ask for a loan, they're going to be asking you this stuff, guys. They're going to want to know that you know your stuff. For the small deals, maybe it's easier to get a loan, but whenever you go to higher deals, the bank has to trust you. The bank has to understand that you do things. For example, in case you're taking a mortgage on a property that is 32 units, meaning 32 apartments, the bank is never going to allow you to manage the property, especially if you don't have any experience. The bank is going to ask you who manages this property, and you cannot reply you have to reply a person, and how much this person has in experience of managing properties. They will ask you. They will ask you things to make sure that the property covers the expenses, that the property has enough cash flow to sustain the debt and the downturn in the market, and they want to make sure that if they give you money, it's safe for them. Right? Because if I give you 60,000 euros, I want to make sure that you can pay me back these 60,000 euros. So it's like they're making all these controls on you. It's not like controls, because eventually it's not a bad thing. They are your partners, and they want to make sure that you can make money on the deal. Because if you don't, well, they're not making money either, because eventually, well, they will take the property and they will resell it, but they're going to lose eventually, because you are losing money on the property. So they actually want to help you to understand the deal, and this is why you have to know these terms. This is why you have to understand real estate, and you have to know what you're doing, because brokers, sellers, people, investors, or banks are going to be asking you this stuff. So I hope you really enjoyed, guys. If you did, please press like button or subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be releasing more in-depth videos about real estate, and I'm going to see you guys on the next episode. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching.